Russia probably will be pressured to withdraw from Crimea. You then will rebuild the institutions as part of an internationally organized process. In other words, you get rid of the Russian proxy officials, and then you'll stage the referendum. Now, the Russians, every step of the way, will scream that this is rigged, that this is basically against them. They wanted, they're going to say basically, y'all are ganging up on us. Fact of the matter is that at the end of the day, Ukraine's not going to give Crimea to Russia. There's no reason why they should. And at the end of the day, you're going to have a Russian acceptance.
So, Scott, thank you so much for joining me. The first question I wanted to ask you was what you make of the recent drone strikes on Moscow.
Well, we've had the series of drone strikes, especially since May the 3rd, when drones approached the Kremlin. None of these drone strikes has caused civilian casualties or mass civilian casualties, which is what you see on a daily basis with the Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities. Instead, the drone strikes, and although the Ukrainians have not claimed them, they've said privately, we're overseeing local groups for carrying them out. They're more psychological in effect. They cause a little bit of damage, but look at where they're causing the damage. These high rise towers in Moscow that have been hit twice since the weekend. These are not just towers which are the center of Moscow's financial district. There are three Russian ministries who operate out of those towers. If you add that to the fact that when these strikes take place, Moscow has had to close one of its international airports, they've had to mobilize their security forces, it brings Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine back to the Russians to say, yeah, this is what you have brought on yourself. It does rattle the Kremlin because it shows vulnerability. They have not been able not only not to, they haven't been able to conquer Ukraine, they haven't been able to get rid of the Zelensky government, and now they can't even stop the attacks on their own territory. But it also perhaps rattles some of the Russian people as well. I don't think the attacks will stop Vladimir Putin's invasion. I think he's too dug in for that. But I think it does add to that feeling of instability where others might take notice at some point and go, do we really think we're winning here?
Do you think that we could see more of these drone strikes occurring in Moscow?
Oh, I have no doubt that you're going to see drone strikes not only in Moscow, but you're going to see drone strikes which actually have a military significance that take place elsewhere. So inside Russia, there have been drone strikes in the bordering regions, especially the region of Belgorod. And there you're trying to hit oil installations, ammunition depots, hit rail lines. But the most significant attacks from that perspective have been on Russian occupied Crimea, this peninsula on the Black Sea, because ever since last summer, they've been able to hit key Russian installations. They've hit the naval headquarters. They've hit, again, oil depots. They've exploded ammunition depots. They've hit military bases. And there you're not just having a psychological effect, you're actually hindering what Russia could do to pursue its attacks on Ukraine and potentially what Ukraine can do, what Russia can do to defend itself against the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which is now entering its
Mm.
third month.
Ukraine's been having missile attacks and attacks like this for so long that every single day they're countering them with anti missile technology. But what does it say that these drone strikes are actually penetrating into Russia? I mean, does it show that they don't have the military power to be able to fend off these strikes from wherever they're coming from?
I think there's a real interesting connection between the Russian strikes on Ukraine and then these strikes, probably supervised by the Ukrainians on Russia. And it's not the connection of equating the two. There's not a connection of saying, oh my gosh, when Ukraine is able to hit, a symbol, a Moscow building, and blow out a few windows, that's the same as the hundreds, indeed thousands of civilians who've been killed by the Russians in aerial attacks in the past 18 months. Now, the connection is this. On the one hand, Russia, despite those 18 months of missile and drone strikes, has not broken Ukraine. You might remember last October, those attacks escalated on cities across Ukraine to try to freeze Ukrainians out by breaking the energy grid. The energy grid has been repaired. And at this point, although you have to prepare for what might happen this winter, you still have Ukraine able not only to fight the war, but to protect its people, to provide power, to provide lights, to provide heating. On the other hand, you now have Russians who, of course, they're not going to wind up, going into the deep freeze because of this. We're not talking about knocking out all of Russia's energy grid. But you now see the fact that Ukraine has the capability to do this. So, in 3 words, what do these strikes on Moscow symbolize? Ukraine still stands. Thank God I remember to turn the two the other way around. You can cut that bit out.
Yeah, I might leave it in. Um,
Okay.
I wanted to ask more just about Ukraine's counteroffensive. I mean, how is it shaping up?
The Ukraine counteroffensive is advancing gradually. And the word here is gradually. And I put that there to get a sense of realism in terms of what's happened. This counteroffensive, when it started in back at the start of June, I think there were some folks in the media because Ukraine's previous counteroffensive last September had been so successful in taking territory in the northeast and the Kharkiv region had been so rapid, and then eventually taking territory in the south by November in the Kherson region. Everybody said, "Oh well, this is going to be really quick. This is it." Well, no, that was an unreasonable expectation. The Russians had been building up defenses in the east and in the south of the country in these 4 occupied regions. They've been building up the defenses for months, and we're talking about trenches. We're talking about uh, layers of wire. We're talking about especially about minefields to slow up the advance of Ukrainian armored vehicles. So there hasn't been a quick victory, but Ukraine didn't expect that. Where we are right now is in terms of territory, there's been about 250 square kilometers which have been liberated by Ukraine. More than 200 of that has been in the south, in what's called the border between the Zaporizhia and Donetsk regions, and almost 50 kilometers up in the east around a city called Bakhmut, where there's been fighting for more than a year. And the advance is something where it may only be a kilometer a day, but it's still a square kilometer a day. And gradually you wear down the Russian defenses. Now, what the Russians are hoping is we'll keep saying that Ukraine is failing. We'll keep saying that they are doomed to fail because what the Russians are trying to do is to break public opinion supporting Ukraine, to try to say to people in countries like the UK, but also the US, Europe, also other countries like Australia, stop giving assistance to Ukraine. Just stop because it's not going to work. And so what you really have is not a question of will the Ukrainian counteroffensive succeed? Gradually, it will keep advancing, but will Ukraine be halted by Russian disinformation and by Russian political warfare to try to get the rest of the world to step away from this? So far, that hasn't happened. I mean, the UK, for example, has provided long-range missiles, Storm Shadows. Many countries have provided tanks. The open question we have right now, because this would help the counteroffensive further, is do you give Ukraine more air power to take control of the skies as well? And at this point, Washington in particular is still holding out about this because they're calibrating not do we want to pull away from Ukraine so it doesn't succeed, but do we want to do this too quickly where it winds up, well, causing further problems inside Russia, including perhaps the fall of Vladimir Putin.
On the air power, I mean, a lot of people have, defense analysts have kind of said that without the air power, when Ukraine is making its gains in the counteroffensive, they need the air cover to be able to kind of, cover them literally as they're trying to go into Russian occupied territory. I mean,
what if I could explain that? What happens in the counteroffensive is okay. So Ukraine faces these really, really built up defenses, but gradually they break through, and they've broken through the first line of defense in the south, and they take a village, for example. What happens is that the Russians then immediately try to counter by firing artillery on that village and by trying to bomb it, right? So in succeeding in a counteroffensive, it's not only taking the territory, but then being able to hold the territory. And so what the air power would allow you to do is it would blunt the Russian reaction. It also would have a huge symbolic effect, which should not be underestimated as well. I think eventually we'll get the F-16s, which will be provided to Ukraine, but I have a sense that that will not be before the end of this year. And so what we continue to have is more of a gradual grind. It's more of at least a 1,500-meter race rather than a sprint, because again, the Russian military, although it has been badly damaged in this war, was the second largest military in the world. So you wouldn't expect them to completely collapse within a few months across all of Ukraine.
And you were speaking before about how the West is concerned about giving too much too quickly. It could lead to the fall of Vladimir Putin. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think what has always marked this 18-month invasion by Vladimir Putin has been a calibration, not just by the US, not just by the UK, but by many countries, which is, on the one hand, let's make sure that Ukraine is not overrun, is not conquered by Putin. On the other hand, how do we prevent this from escalating into a wider war or into a wider conflict? And you might remember the debate that was had uh, whether there should be tanks provided to Ukraine, even to provide, to support Ukraine in terms of going onto the offensive. Would that unsettle the Russians too much? How would they react? Then we've had the ongoing debate of, uh, these incursions into Russia, including the drone attacks. Do we accept that those are taking place? And now you have the debate over whether air power would raise the stakes too much, where Russia will say, oh, it's us versus NATO, it's us versus other countries who we might attack, like the Baltic states, for example, or Poland. The Russians will also try to add to that impression, and they've done it ever since the start of the invasion by thumping their chest and going, nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons. Now, even though nuclear weapons will do little to change the battlefield, and in fact, if Putin uses them, it isolates him, you know, from countries like China and India, who've warned him not to do it. Just dangling that threat of nuclear weapons is, how crazy do you think I am? And indeed, a couple of days ago, to really crystallize this calibration that is faced by the international community, the former president, a man named Dmitry Medvedev, who used to be fairly sensible, but now, quite frankly, is just simply off his head. He said, if the Ukraine counteroffensive succeeds, we'll use the nukes, right? So you get into that Doctor Strangelove moment for people who remember that film from the 1960s in terms of, does Putin turn into Doctor Strangelove and unleash this? I don't think he does, but there are still some politicians who say, let's give him an off ramp. Let's let him save face. How can he save face even as he loses territory? And that idea of him being able to save face means you don't necessarily run the US F-16 aircraft into the Ukraine theater too quickly.
I mean, I guess the difference for the F-16s versus the drone attacks is that, to my understanding, the drones are created by Ukraine. Um, they're Ukrainian made weapons, whereas the weapons that the West has given to Ukraine, they've said, you can have these on the basis that you're not going to use them against Russia. You're only going to
No,
use them for defense.
well, I think that's clear. I mean, I think
Yeah,
the F-16s are not going to be used against
yeah,
Russia. So I think that's a red herring of an argument, if I may. Not from you, but from those who,
yeah.
analysts who have made it. We had this argument with another question of weaponry in the war, and that's over the cluster munitions. And before the U.S. cluster munitions, the agreement to supply them, which was made a few weeks ago, Ukraine came back and they agreed to 5 conditions. They made a five principles, and the principles the Ukrainians set out included no attacks on urban areas, because of course that's attacks on civilians, which would be a war crime. But it also included no attacks inside Russia. So I think it's quite easy for Ukraine to say, no, look, just as they said to the UK over the Storm Shadow long range missiles, when the UK finally provided them, and then the French who have provided their counterpart as well. Look, they're just for the Ukrainian battlefield. I think the question now is, what is the Ukrainian battlefield, if you really want to get into detail on this, if you have X-16s, if you have the missiles? And that is, I think, their use in the east in terms of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, fine. Russia has occupied parts of those areas since 2014, but they had not annexed them until last autumn. In the south, in the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, fine, you can use the advanced weapons there because Russia had not annexed them. I think the Crimea is the case here because Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and has tried to make it part of Russia for the past 9 years. And if, without knowing this for sure, a little bit of speculation here is I think there's a bit of going back and forth between various capitals in Kyiv on terms of, do you stop at the border with Crimea? And indeed, that was discussed between the Zelensky government and the US CIA director, William Burns, at the start of June, which is, do you stop at the Crimean border and then say to Putin, now it's time to talk? So I think that is the diplomatic counterpart or the political counterpart to what we're seeing on the battlefield and the question of weapons supplies.
Hmm. I mean, how likely do you think it is that Ukraine's able to take Crimea at the end of this conflict. I mean, it was, it was annexed by Russia nearly 10 years ago. We are seeing some movement there. Little Ukrainian kind of surface level sea drones striking parts of the coastline.
I, I, I don't think, I think the question of this current counteroffensive is primarily on the four regions in the east and the south. It's not, we're going to take Crimea. And I think the Zelensky government is probably going back to the document that it put out in the spring of 2022, uh, one which pro-Kremlin activists have conveniently forgotten here in the UK as well as other countries, which was, all right, Russian forces withdraw from the east and the south of Ukraine, and then we enter a consultation period over what happens on Crimea. And I think it was a 10-year consultation period, which is all right. We're going to talk about the future of that because there are a lot of Russian speakers there. There has been Russian claims on that territory for a long, long time, and because the Russians are entrenched there. I think that's probably where we go back to this. If I was gaming this out as we go into next year, is that we're really talking about the Russians being forced to withdraw from all areas except for Crimea, which is where their naval headquarters are based, the Black Sea headquarters. And then you get the political and the diplomatic pressure for them to reduce their military presence and to allow to a political process, which will take place possibly over months and or years.
As in, what a political process, like a diplomatic process that would just. What do you mean by that?
I think you probably go back to an internationally supervised referendum. I think you go back to a referendum of the people. I mean, there was a referendum in Crimea after Russia annexed it in 2014, but trust me, that wasn't an internationally
Yeah.
organized one. Have been questions of the referenda for Crimea even before 2014 in terms of since 2014 in terms of resolving its status. When we talk about the Minsk process, what should happen with Crimea, but the Russians held out against that. I think we're probably going back to that, which is Russia probably will be pressured to withdraw from Crimea. You then will rebuild the institutions as part of an internationally organized process. In other words, you get rid of the Russian proxy officials, and then you'll stage the referendum. Now, the Russians, every step of the way, will scream that this is rigged, that this is basically against them. They wanted, they're going to say basically, y'all are ganging up on us. Fact of the matter is that at the end of the day, Ukraine's not going to give Crimea to Russia. There's no reason why they should. And at the end of the day, you're going to have a Russian acceptance if they are defeated on the battlefield elsewhere in Ukraine, that they've got no alternative but to accept some type of international process over that peninsula.
If that does happen, and there's an international kind of supervised referendum, and Crimeans, they vote to come back into Ukraine, what would Crimea? I mean, there's a question of what would Crimea even look like under Ukraine. It's been nearly 10 years. I think Zelensky's permanent aide, I think that was in Crimea, warned that you know Ukrainians in Crimea that had helped the Russians, they may face legal battles from the Ukrainians after all of this is over.
Um, First, let me give a little bit of wider context before answering that direct question, which, if you were trying to read what Vladimir Zelensky is saying, try this statement on for size. He said last weekend in an interview with a newspaper about, how long does this go on, et cetera. And he said, well, I don't think Putin's going to be here in 30 years, right? So I don't think he can. He says, indeed, I don't think Putin will be here in 10 years. I think this has taken a toll on him. And I think there's a little clue there. And I think there's a clue there, which is, all right, if Putin can hang on into power, he can't hang on to power indefinitely. So if you look at Crimea, we simply play the process out, the political process out. Now, what would it look like? Well, I think you have a clue here. You have a couple of important clues, and that is, remember that Ukraine liberated territory which the Russians had held in Kherson in the south and in Kharkiv in the northeast. And there's Russian speakers in those areas as well. Indeed, there's a lot of Russian speakers in Odessa, which the Russians failed to take. And the Ukrainian governance has been largely welcomed. You haven't seen like an insurgency against Ukrainian governance in those territories. You've seen restoration in those territories to an extent. It's been challenged, for example, when the Russians, and let's call it out for what they did, when they blew up the Novakova Dam, and flooded the Kherson region, but you still are attempting, Ukraine with international support, to provide reconstruction, which takes place. All right, you're absolutely right that Crimea is a case where the Russians have been there not just for months, but they've been there for years. But as we have seen in the eastern areas where Russia has occupied for years, in Donetsk and Luhansk, there have been a number of people who have been turned against Moscow because you attacked our country, even if we lived in areas with your proxy officials. And I suspect there are some of those people in Crimea as well. What is going to be vital is that you get to providing the appearance of governance, of rights, of a legal and political system that operates for the benefit of all. You show competence that takes place. That will not be a short process. It will be quite a lengthy process. The Russians will try to undermine it. But if you show a step-by-step approach to responsibility, that's how you counter the idea that simply because Russia had held this territory for 9 years and then drug it into a war with the rest of Ukraine, that it should be entitled to do so for the next decade.
And I guess when we look at kind of what this landscape looks like when the war is over, we had Robert Fox on last week, and he was saying actually, when the war ends, maybe Ukraine joins NATO, and NATO, just funnels weapons in there. But what the border looks like is kind of a demilitarized zone, and the conflict is just frozen in time, a bit like Korea. And maybe it's frozen in time just until Putin's gone.
Well, let's take, I think, for me, nothing's easy here, but what I think you can project is, and that is Ukraine effectively now has de facto security guarantees. And if you actually look at what happened at the NATO summit um, in June, which some people completely got the wrong end of the stick of and said it was a failure, it wasn't. Look, NATO. There's going to be no NATO membership. Sorry, there'll be no NATO membership for Ukraine until after the war because you have to win a war first. But there will be a program for providing the security guarantees, bolstered by economic, financial, um, and technical assistance, matched by steps on the Ukrainian side. That's what the G7 strategic framework set out. And so again, in those areas that you have liberated, you roll that out. You roll that out for people on a day-to-day basis. And I don't think you're going to see at the end of the day a frozen conflict for a long period of time in Donetsk and Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia. I think the Russians simply, I think, will face the fact that they will be isolated against the international community if they continue to hold those territories for years on end. So you'll then have the challenge there. I think while that is going on, so let's assume that the war then ends and that we have this discussion going on in Crimea. I think what you will have is the path to NATO membership for Ukraine, which will be done on a very open basis in terms of here's the checklist of conditions you have to meet. And it'll take months. I don't think it'll take years, but it will take months. Here's the fact, or here's the fundamental. If Russia cannot win on the battlefield, Russia does not get to dictate the terms of what happens afterwards. And so I think not only is it a question of Ukraine being in NATO, but what has already happened. Because please remember, Sweden, if Turkey lists objections, which I think they will this autumn, in NATO. Finland, in NATO. Increased assurances to the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Increased assurances to other states in Central and Eastern Europe, such as Poland, such as Romania, which is, all right, guys, we've got your back. In other words, I can't necessarily give you the specifics of when this is going to happen in terms of time, but here's what I find to be the paradox. Vladimir Putin launched this invasion in February 2022 with the idea that within a few weeks, his forces would control Kyiv and the Zelensky government would be gone, that Western support for Ukraine would be broken, that the West would be divided. 18 months later, Vladimir Putin has energized Europe. He has energized, to an extent, the Ukraine, despite other issues like Brexit that we're still dealing with. He's energized the United States. He's energized the international community. And he's energized NATO. That if you go back to 2022, just before this invasion, there were all kinds of questions of where are we going? How much are we spending on defense? What is our purpose? Vladimir Putin gave everyone a sense of purpose with what he's done. And I think to that extent, this will be recorded as one of history's biggest failed gambles.
Scott, I don't want to take up too much of your time because I know that we could sit here and just play this out all day, even though I know our viewers would love that. I just wanted to move on to Poland and Belarus before I let you go. Poland is claiming that Belarusian helicopters violated its airspace, and the key difference here is that Poland is a member of NATO, and Poland's ramping up its security along the border in response. I mean, should we be watching out for more conflict there?
I mean, you always be watchful. It would be ridiculous not to, but I think to put it in context would be pretty useful here. I think what Poland said on the immediate question of the Belarusian aircraft is no, let's keep to the lines that we've drawn here. Uh, Ever since the start of this conflict, we had a question what Belarus would do. Uh, Not that Belarus would necessarily attack Poland, but would Belarus send its forces in to attack Ukraine? And for 18 months, even though he effectively has to be subservient to Vladimir Putin, the Belarusian leader, Alexander Lukashenko, has held out against the direct commitment of Belarusian forces. Russian forces can stage from Belarus into Ukraine, but no Belarusian forces are involved. So Lukashenko is already balanced versus Moscow in terms of how far he goes with this. Now, what has changed the dynamic in the past few weeks, of course, is that after their mini rebellion against the Kremlin, the Wagner Group fighters, under the deal that was struck with their leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, relocated to Belarus. And we've got estimates, they kind of vary, but let's say, for example, we're talking about 5,000 Wagner Group mercenaries who are in Belarus. What are they in Belarus for? The evidence I think we have so far is that the Wagner Group forces will be able to train Belarusians. That will give them a purpose. They will train Belarusians, for example, on matters that would be useful for internal security, because remember, Lukashenko has faced mass protest in recent years. But the Wagner Group forces don't have their heaviest equipment with them. And I think that's a tip off that they're not going to be used to attack Poland, that they'll be used for internal Belarusian matters. Because remember, if you equip the Wagner Group forces with heavy equipment, they actually tried to attack Moscow a few months ago. So I think what's happening in Belarus is more of a balancing act that has to do with Russia's domestic situation as well as Russian Belarusian relations. But yeah, but still the Poles will be watchful as they should be.
Thank you to Scott Lucas. He's a professor of international politics at the Clinton Institute at the University College Dublin. If you'd like to hear more from people like Scott Lucas, incredible analysis on Ukraine, Russia, China, US politics, British politics, and everything in between, please subscribe down below.